Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into the awe-inspiring and, let's be honest, highly controversial legacy of a man whose financial gravity literally shaped modern America. We're talking about a guy who, with a single word, or just the stroke of a pen, could save a massive corporation from total collapse or absolutely doom it to bankruptcy. Loved by some, definitely hated by others. This is the story of John Pierpont Morgan.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Because to really wrap your head around the sheer magnitude of this man's influence, you just have to look at the institution that still bears his name today. After 2 centuries of growth and consolidation, J.P. Morgan Chase is the biggest bank in the world by market cap. They hold an estimated $3 trillion in assets. $3 trillion. That's a staggering number, and it's built on a foundation laid way back, well over a century ago. But as we dig through the history for this explainer, a really fascinating central conflict pops up. Was J.P. Morgan a greedy monopolist, just exploiting the system to line his own pockets? Or was he the necessary stabilizer of what was then a wildly chaotic American economy? Throughout this, we're going to look at the facts directly from his life to help you weigh both sides of that very heavy coin.
Section 1. Rise of the Financial Titan.
Now, Morgan's early life actually set a pretty surprising stage for his staggering ambition later on. Born in 1837 into serious wealth, John's childhood was, it was surprisingly bleak. He was incredibly sickly. We're talking brutal coughing fits, seizures, rheumatic fever. His dad actually sent him to live completely alone on the Azores Islands for almost a year, just hoping the salty ocean air would help him recover. But underneath that frail exterior, a blazing hot temper and a massive appetite for risk. Like in 1859, using company money, he made this totally reckless, unapproved gamble to buy an entire shipment of Brazilian coffee in New Orleans. His senior partners were furious, even though he actually managed to turn a profit. But the real turning point, the one that changed everything, was a personal tragedy. In 1861, he married his first love, Amelia. Just 4 months after the wedding, she tragically died of tuberculosis. Morgan was absolutely inconsolable, and so he threw himself relentlessly, just entirely, into Wall Street.
And throwing himself into finance quickly led to some major controversy. During the American Civil War, rather than actually fighting, he paid $300 for a substitute to take his place, by the way, Morgan profited. He financed the purchase of 5,000 obsolete surplus carbine rifles from the government for $3.50 each. A group he was working with made some minor adjustments to them and almost immediately sold those exact same rifles back to the government for $22 each. Think about that for a second. That's an over 600% markup. While undeniably lucrative move, this stark example of war profiteering was, as you can imagine, deeply unpopular with both the government and the American public.
Section 2. Organizing the Railroads.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how he tackled his first massive industry conquest. At the time, industries like steel and oil were dominated by single magnates. But the railroads? They were a complete mess of fierce price-slashing competition. But Morgan didn't see chaos. He saw an opportunity for absolute control. He used a playbook that literally became known as Morganization. He'd take over these underfinanced railroad companies, completely streamline their management, and merge them into a dominant monopoly to achieve economies of scale. But here is the absolute crucial point to remember. When railroads came crawling to him for financial help, he flat out refused unless he was given full control. He wasn't just some passive investor, he demanded a seat at the absolute head of the table, reshuffling leadership however he wanted so he could set whatever prices he wanted.
And the scale of his success using this exact tactic was just breathtaking. Before long, John owned 1/3 of all the railroads in America. 1/3. And remember, back then, 60% of America's entire stock market capitalization was just railroad companies. Because Morgan had stabilized the industry, European money just flooded in, and his personal wealth and power grew exponentially.
Now, as his power grew, so did his physical presence. Morgan was intensely intimidating. Towering height, a really aggressive way of speaking. He also suffered from rosacea and rhinophyma. Those are skin conditions that made his nose greatly enlarged and disfigured, and he was incredibly self-conscious about it. He demanded that all his official portraits be heavily retouched so his nose looked normal, which is exactly why in most historical photos you don't see the reality of this terrifying figure sitting across the boardroom table.
Section 3. The Billion-Dollar Steel Empire.
So, having conquered the railroads, Morgan decides to guide his empire into a massive escalation of power. He sets his sights on the absolute titan of the steel industry, Andrew Carnegie. Now, Carnegie was looking to retire, and Morgan basically just told him, name your price. Carnegie asks for $480 million, which, by the way, would be the largest business deal in history up to that point. Morgan agreed on the spot. He literally didn't even blink. In fact, he later confessed to Carnegie that he gladly would have paid $100 million more.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer weight of that transaction. By merging Carnegie Steel with some other businesses in 1901, Morgan formed U.S. Steel. It became the world's first ever billion-dollar corporation, boasting a market cap of $1.4 billion. To put that into perspective for a second, all the manufacturing in the entire United States combined was capitalized at roughly $9 billion. So with one move, Morgan suddenly controlled roughly 2/3 of all American steel production.
And his talent for creating these unstoppable corporate giants, it truly knew no bounds. He financed Thomas Edison's early electricity experiments and eventually merged competitors together to create General Electric. He was also instrumental in creating the telecom giant that would eventually become AT&T. He was quite literally building the infrastructure of the modern world, piece by piece.
Section 4. Saving the U.S. economy.
But Morgan's ultimate test came not in building companies, but in saving the country itself. During the Panic of 1893, Morgan steps right out of the private boardroom and takes on the role of an unofficial central banker. The economy had collapsed, stocks plummeted, hundreds of banks failed, and foreign investors started cashing in their American bonds for physical gold. By 1895, the U.S. government's gold reserves had plummeted to a dangerously low $9 million. The U.S. was literally on the verge of defaulting on its loans. So Morgan travels to Washington, meets with President Grover Cleveland, and proposes this audacious scheme. Using this obscure old Civil War statute to completely bypass Congress, Morgan formed a private syndicate to buy $65 million worth of 30-year gold bonds. Once Cleveland signed off, Morgan wired his team in New York, and they bought out the bonds in just 22 minutes. 22 minutes! He miraculously saved the U.S. from financial ruin. But, as a shrewd businessman, he also secured generous rates and made a massive profit doing it. It was a serious double-edged sword, and it deeply concerned a public that was already super wary of one single man wielding so much unchecked power.
Section 5. The Roosevelt Rivalry.
That growing public concern over Morgan's immense power eventually found a champion in the White House. This introduces a dramatic shift that finally threatened his monopolistic empire. See, for years, Morgan had enjoyed a very cozy relationship with President William McKinley. McKinley basically allowed Morgan's mega mergers to proceed completely unchecked. But when McKinley was tragically assassinated in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became president, and Roosevelt took a completely different view. He immediately ordered the Justice Department to aggressively enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, and his main target? He went straight after and ultimately broke up Morgan's massive railroad holding company, the Northern Securities Corporation.
The animosity between these two men was palpable. It was intense. Years later, when Morgan heard that Roosevelt was going on an African safari, Morgan notoriously remarked, "Good, I hope the first lion meets him, does his duty." Wow. It perfectly captures the absolute venom that existed between the undisputed king of Wall Street and the trust-busting president.
Yet, incredibly, when the Panic of 1907 struck, and banks were once again on the verge of total collapse, Roosevelt reluctantly had to call on Morgan for help again. The U.S. Treasury even pitched in $25 million to Morgan's rescue effort. Morgan, who was 70 years old at this time and battling a terrible cold, summoned the nation's top bankers to his private library on Madison Avenue. His plan? They needed to inject giant sums of money into salvageable competitors to stop the bleeding. But when the bankers hesitated, Morgan literally locked the library doors. No joke. He refused to let the most powerful men in finance leave that room until they agreed to his bailout plan by morning. And you know what? It worked. He averted another national disaster.
Let's move to Section 6 and see how this builds. The end of an era.
Despite those heroics in 1907, the public backlash was reaching a total boiling point in the twilight of Morgan's life. The era of the unchecked robber baron was definitively ending. The public and lawmakers finally realized it was incredibly dangerous for the economic stability of the entire United States to rely entirely on the whims and the health of one single man. Morgan was summoned to testify before the Peugeot Committee, which was actively investigating Wall Street's so-called money trust. These hearings made Morgan the very public face of Wall Street's immense, concentrated power, and ultimately, this backlash paved the way for the establishment of the Federal Reserve.
All that intense public scrutiny took a really heavy toll on him.
Morgan's mental state deteriorated, and he actually suffered multiple nervous breakdowns. Interestingly enough, he was scheduled to board the Titanic for its maiden voyage, but he canceled at the absolute last moment due to health issues, narrowly avoiding that historic disaster. Ultimately, John Pierpont Morgan died while on vacation in Rome on March 31, 1913, at the age of 75, leaving his vast, sprawling financial empire to his son.
And that leaves us with a pretty profound question as we look at his legacy today. The company he built holds trillions of dollars, and it's the largest bank in the world. So as we evaluate the financial landscape of our own time, we really have to ask, do modern megabanks embody the necessary economic stability that Morgan relentlessly sought to build? Or do they represent the unchecked, concentrated power that the American public so deeply feared? It's definitely something to think about the next time you see the Chase logo. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems that shape our world.